Hello friends and enemies, welcome back to Weird Deck Techs. My name is Toxy, and today we're going to be talking about worms, a bit of a weird archetype for Yu-Gi-Oh! The thing about worms is that there are so many cards throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history that are named worm, but the actual archetype of worms is very specific. It's full of some light reptile type monsters that generally through their art resemble like aliens of some sort, or some of them even look like bacteria in my opinion. And this archetype is very weird because it's kind of non-committal and doesn't really know what it wants to do. Its main two effects that it revolves around are graveyard shenanigans and flip effects, but not really. You'll see what I mean when we get into the deck here in just a second. If I'm being honest, it's an archetype that I didn't know was fully realized. I had seen Worm Barsis, which is the worm I decided to use for the thumbnail. I had seen that card before because I pulled a bunch of those, but I've never really seen the other worm cards. I might have seen Worm Illidan once or twice, but out of that, I've never seen the other worm cards. So seeing these cards for the first time and trying to make a deck out of them was kind of hard. It took me a few hours to actually make the deck. And I guess you'll see why. Let's go ahead and get into it.
Alright, so here it is, the worm deck. Let's go ahead and take a look at it right here. As you can see as we move down here, the deck, the archetype itself consists of mostly monster cards, and right off the bat I do have to say that because the deck didn't have a fusion spell of any kind, I had to break the pure archetype rule to add in my super polys and my future fusion. But let's go ahead and take a look at the deck and then we'll talk about it. We'll go over all the cards, then we'll talk about it afterward. So starting up at the top, we've got one copy of Worm King. Worm King says, this card can be tribute summoned in face-up attack position by tributing one reptile-type worm monster. You can tribute one reptile-type worm monster to select one card your opponent controls and destroy it. So, a slow removal type of card. You can already see that we're getting into the graveyard shenanigans, putting stuff into the graveyard here. So next up we got Worm Queen. We have two copies of her. She says you can tribute summon this card in face-up attack position by tributing one reptile-type monster. Worm monster, sorry. Once per turn, you can tribute one reptile-type worm monster to special summon one reptile-type worm monster from your deck with a level less than or equal to the tributed monster. So it's kind of just a trade out, play something from your deck. Kind of like a search spell, a more advanced search spell. We've got Worm Victory up next. We've got two copies of him. Worm Victory has a flip effect. Destroy all face-up monsters on the field except reptile-type worm monsters. This card gains 500 attack for each reptile-type worm monster in your graveyard. So we can kind of see the graveyard shenanigans working there. It gets a buff for the graveyard, and then it's also a board wipe, essentially. Next up, we've got one copy of Worm Prince. If this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can add one reptile-type worm monster from your deck to your hand. Destroy this card during the end phase if you do not control another reptile-type worm monster. So, quick search spell, that's all. Next up, we got two copies of Worm Illidan. Each time a card is set on your side of the field, place one worm counter on this card. You can remove two worm counters from this card to select one card your opponent controls and destroy it. So there's another removal spell, slow removal there. We've got one copy of Worm Rakuya. This card can only declare an attack the turn that it was flipped face up. If this card attacks, it is changed to face down defense position at the end of the battle phase. I mainly kept this in there just because it's, a quick flip and then flip face down. It can help Worm Illidan out. Next up, we have two copies of Worm Zex. When this card is normal summoned, you can send one reptile-type worm monster from your deck to the graveyard. If you control a face-up Worm Yagan, this card cannot be destroyed by battle. Yeah, just another removal spell. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Not a removal spell. It is another graveyard spell. I think I kept Worm Yagan out of this deck. I don't remember why, but I'll look it up later and we'll get into it when we talk about the deck. Next up, we've got 2 copies of Worm Cartaros. Flip. Add 1 level 4 or lower reptile type worm monster from your deck to your hand. There is our 1 search spell of the entire deck. Although I do believe that the W Meteorite is also a search spell for the higher reptile type monsters, but we'll get into that later. I don't want to rush. Next up, we've got Worm Solid. This card gains 100 defense for each reptile type worm monster in your graveyard. If your opponent takes battle damage from attacking this card, at the end of the damage step, select 1 spell or trap your opponent controls and destroy it. So this is a removal spell that utilizes, it's the best utilized graveyard shenanigans that we have. It gains defense for the graveyard, and then it's a removal spell if your opponent would take battle damage because of that raised defense. So we've got 3 copies of him in there. Next up, we've got Worm Milidith. Flip, you can equip this card to a monster your opponent controls as an equipped card. Inflict 400 damage to the controller of the equipped monster during each standby phase. We have 2 of those in the deck. We have 3 of those in the deck. Next up, we've got 1 copy of Worm Jettlelixp. Jettlelixp? I don't know. Flip. When this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard this turn, special summon it from the graveyard in face-up defense position. Next up, we've got 2 copies of Worm Falco. Flip, change all face-up reptile-type worm monsters you control to face-down defense position except this card. So just helping out Worm Illidan there. We've got 2 copies of Worm Opera. Flip, all face-up monsters on the field lose 500 attack except for reptile-type worm monsters, so a buff for your deck there. Next up, we've got 1 copy of Worm Lynx. Flip, during each of the end phase, if this card is face up, draw 1 card. So it has to stay on the field, which is why we only got 1 copy, but it's a draw spell, so might as well have it in there. Next up, we have Worm Hope. Flip, when this card is flipped face up by an opponent's monster's attack, draw 1 card. And when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard. So it's a mix draw spell graveyard shenanigans card. Next up, we've got 1 copy of Worm Apocalypse. Flip and target 1 spell or trap on the field, destroy that target. Very simple removal spell. I figured only having 1 because we also have a bunch of other worms that already do removal that might be a little bit easier to get out. I mean, of course, this is a level 1, so super easy to just play face down, but I figured the other cards that also do removal we're going to be playing a lot, or trying to at least. And lastly, for monsters, we've got 2 copies of Worm Ugly. When you tribute summon a reptile-type worm monster by tributing this card, you can special summon this card from your graveyard to your opponent's side of the field in face-up attack position. So, a little bit of, filling up your opponent's side of the field there. This combos with some other worm cards, but I kind of just felt it necessary to keep it at this. Next up, we've got 3 continuous spells. Worm Call. Once per turn, if your opponent controls a monster and you control no monsters, you can special summon 1 reptile-type worm monster from your hand in face-down defense position. So it's a get a free monster, but you have to make sure that you control no monsters, which makes it kind of bad. Moving on. I've added 2 quick play super polymerizations. Discard 1 card, fusion summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from either field as fusion material. Neither player can activate cards or effects in response to this card's activation. The reason that I put super poly in here rather than regular poly is just to get those cards into the graveyard, just to, help boost up some of those other worms that require cards in the graveyard. But that's about it. Next up, we've got Future Fusion, a continuous type spell. We've got 2 copies of this. During your first standby phase after this card's activation, show 1 fusion monster in your extra deck and send the fusion materials listed on it from your main deck to the graveyard. During your second standby phase after this card's activation, fusion summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck with the same name as the monster that you revealed, and target it with this card. When this card leaves the field, destroy that target, and when that target is destroyed, destroy this card. I should have put 3 copies of this in there, but I put 2 just to keep room for the super polys. It's fine. And lastly, for the main deck, we've got a normal trap W Nebula Meteorite, which is a worm archetype card. Change all face-down monsters on the field to face-up defense position. During the end phase this turn, change all face-up light reptile monsters you control to face-down defense position, then draw one card for each. After that, you can special summon one level 7 or higher light reptile monster from your deck. So, easy way to get out Worm King or Worm Queen. Could be super overpowered, but in this deck it really isn't. Let me scroll down there. I'm sorry. There's W Meteorite. And let's go ahead and get in the final part, the extra deck. We've got Worm Zero. Let's pull it up there. Alright, so Worm Zero is a fusion type monster. It requires 2 or more reptile type worm monsters to be summoned. For each fusion material monster with a different name used to fusion summon this card, it gains 500 attack and gains these effects. If it's got 2 or more, once per turn, you can select one reptile type monster in your graveyard and special summon it in face down defense position. 4 or more, you can remove from play one reptile type monster from the graveyard and send one monster from the field to the graveyard. And 6 or more, once per turn you can draw a card. So a little bit underwhelming of a boss monster here. We've got, okay, you can grab a reptile type from your graveyard and play it in face down defense position. That's pretty good. But then the 4 and up is just a quick little removal spell, which Worm Queen does just fine. Or Worm King, and then the 6+ is just draw a card, which is a little underwhelming for the boss monster, the supposed boss monster of this deck. So let's go ahead. That's the entire deck in its entirety. So how do I feel about this deck? How would I play this deck? So for me, building this deck for the first time, I said it before, I'm very hesitant to call any archetype bad. I feel like any deck is good as long as you can make it good. This archetype, if you wanted to play it like this, it just, given the way that I've seen, given the knowledge that I have about Yu-Gi-Oh, this just seems straight up bad. I don't like this archetype, especially with, like I said, it's very non-committal. It doesn't seem to know what it wants to do, and when it does know what it wants to do, it doesn't utilize those very well. If I were to make this deck, I'd probably add in, there's a group of insect type worm creatures that have mill effects. I would add those in, but even then, those wouldn't make this very strong. I could add in some generic reptile type, generic reptile support, maybe add in some snake deity cards, maybe some Ogdoadic cards, but I don't think that those would help fix this deck all that much. Somebody said that this deck worked really well with 6 Samurais for a while, which I haven't checked out 6 Samurais in a long time, but I feel like that's a really weird combination, worms and 6 Samurais. If I were to play this deck, I would probably try to throw in some stall spells, but the problem that you run into with stall spells is that eventually you hit a point where it's, oh, is my spell going to stay out? Am I going to be able to stall for an extra turn to get the extra monster out? And I think that's what it comes down to, is that this deck is not only non-committal, but it's also very, very slow to play. And you're just not going to be getting monsters out as fast as you need to, on top of the power that you're already missing from this deck. So, that being said, what can we do to fix this archetype? And that is a very good question to ask with this one specifically, because I don't know. I don't know what you could do. I would say definitely pick either graveyard or flip effect, or if you really wanted to do both, stick with the which card was it here? I believe it was, oh, it wasn't that. I think it was Worm Zero down here. where it brings cards back from the graveyard and puts them in face-down defense position. You could have the deck play off of that. You could also add in some more, a little bit stronger boss monsters for the extra deck that could possibly ramp this deck up. You know, some Xyz monsters, maybe some, you know, Link monsters that require some reptile types. I would have suggested, you know, some of the cosmic slicers or whatever from earlier, but those are very specific to aliens. I don't know many reptile type Xyz or Link monsters, but I think the biggest problem that this deck and a lot of gimmick decks like this suffer from is they could use a card like Medulce Salon or a double summon of their own, which I think would help this deck a little bit, but again, this archetype just seems far from broken to the point of being bad. But those are just my thoughts. That's just how I feel on this deck. And that being said, I can't think of anything else, so we'll go ahead and head it back to me.
So that was Worms. Go ahead and let me know what you think about the deck down in the description below. I should have said it last time, but I'm never going to discourage anybody from using a deck, regardless of how I think of the deck. If you want to try and use it, go ahead and use it yourself. Like I said, most people aren't going to be building pure archetypes like I do. I just find the fun in building pure archetypes. Anyway, that being said, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, drink your water.